Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Building Blocks. I'm Brian Fitzy, and today we are going to be talking about the importance and the theory, the fundamentals behind effects, pedals, and the order that you should be putting them in. Whether you are creating a signal chain for a vocal in a DAW or you're creating a pedal board setup, pretty much any instrument. Actually, let's just say right now, any instrument, period. The order in which you connect the effects really makes all the difference. There is the core fundamental approach to putting these effects in order, and then everything outside of that is going to be experimentation. There is no wrong way to hook things up, but there is a right way to get predictable results and to feed these effects the way that they were kind of meant to be used. So, biggest thing, if we think about taking a clean signal and manipulating it, so let's talk about guitars or any electric instrument that you can plug in with a 1/4-inch cable. We're gonna most likely start with a distortion or an overdrive. So, regardless of what type there is, you're going to usually put that as your very first effect. If you have a tuner, you'll typically put that tuner pedal first. Then you'll have your distortion or overdrive. Overdrives and distortions can be stacked upon one another, and you can use an overdrive as a lead booster and not really add much more dirt to the signal. This is all a matter of taste. This isn't something that I want to get into about the fundamentals of how to dial these effects in and get the best results possible out of each individual effect. I want to just talk about how to lay them out. So you can stack those different effects that way. Coming after that, you might have effects like modulation effects, choruses, flangers, phasers. Those usually work really well after distortions and overdrives. Other types of effects that are going to manipulate the tone are going to be filtering. Filtering effects like wah-wah pedals or envelope filters are usually going to work the best right after your tuner and before the distortion pedals. You can try a wah pedal after your distortion, but you're going to find that the way the distortion changes its tone as you sweep, it might be what you want, it might not be what you want. I like to usually put my envelopes prior to the distortion. That way the distorted signal is, that distortion character stays true. It doesn't get narrowed or widened or focused on any one frequency. I prefer to hit those distortions with what I want to distort. So, same goes for the modulation effects. If I have a chorus or a flanger or a phaser, I don't necessarily want to distort the phased effect or the flanged effect or the chorused effect. I pretty much would be losing the character of those modulation effects. So I want to put those after a distortion. Then there's a variety of other kind of effects. You've got lots of other kinds of filtering. You have, take a look behind me. I've got effects like these synth pedals from Maris. I have got synth pedals from Electro Harmonics. Those pedals might work great after a distortion and before modulation. They might sound really cool after modulation. I would usually like to keep my modulation after, so I'm flanging the signal. So you kind of have to decide up front how you're going to use all the different effects, and that's going to dictate a little bit their space in your signal chain. And that doesn't mean that what you create the very first time around is going to maintain its position forever on your pedal board. You might never even keep that effect on for more than a couple of weeks. You might get rid of it and get something new to fill its place, and then the order will change a little bit. But a lot of these synth effects work really well as the very first effect in your chain. Some of them work great at the very end of your chain, and some of them don't play well with any other pedals. And it's just a matter of figuring out what goes where. After you have your mod effects, you're going to start working with stuff that's going to change the distance, perceived distance, between the sound that you're creating and what the audience hears. Those are going to be time-based and space-based effects. So we're talking delays, whether they're analog or digital, and we're talking about reverbs. Typically, you're going to put your delay, then your reverb. Your reverb should be the very last thing. Now, what I will do before the delay and reverb is I'll put a lead booster there. And here's the thinking behind this. You have your signal, whatever it is, and you have the ability to make it sound further away with reverb. You have the ability to have it double with digital delay or analog delay. When you go to take a solo with that setup, theoretically, if you have the tone that you really like and it needs to be louder, you use a lead booster. Instead of expecting a sound guy to turn you up or to fix that after the fact in the studio, if you were to be doing something live, you want to have that level of control. So a lead booster is usually going to be a thing that just very cleanly and discreetly boosts the signal. I have, up here on this shelf, I have an exotic EP booster that sounds awesome. It's super clean, transparent. There's also EQ pedals that are on this shelf, and the EQ pedals are perfect for that because you might want your lead sound to not have as much low frequency information. Maybe you just want it to cut a little bit more at 2.5K. You can just push a little bit of 2.5K. So when you run those effects and you go into your lead booster, coming out of that, when you go to turn that lead booster off, if you don't want to have an immediate drop off in volume of those time-based effects like the reverb and the delay, you got to have the lead booster before that. So the volume goes up and it hits these time-based effects. And when the lead booster drops, the signal that hit those time-based effects will still be decaying there. So when you switch back to your clean or non-lead sound, your rhythm sound, whatever combination of effects that is, your time-based effects carry on. So it's a little bit of a nice transition. Instead of an abrupt 90-degree drop off a cliff, you've got a nice gentle hill going down, nice slope. So that's a really, really, really important thing to think about when you're creating your pedal board. Different delays can feed delays differently. If you wanted to throw a delay in front of a reverb, you can. What's going to happen is that reverb, that natural sounding or not so natural sounding echo quality, is now going to get stacked on top of itself with whatever frequency, whatever repetition amount you set on the delay. That might be a really cool sound for a certain thing. You might have a delay after your reverb and a delay before the reverb, and you use them in different contexts for different things. I can't think of any personal applications where that would make sense as a individual instrumentalist, whether it was on guitar or any other electric instrument running in. You can run keyboards through all these effects as well. But that's kind of the general concept of the order in which to lay things out. Typical wah, tuner, wah or envelope filter, distortions and overdrives, modulation, lead booster, maybe synth effects somewhere in there, and then delay, then reverb. Other effects that you could put in there are going to be things like compressors that are going to be really useful. I use a compressor and a clean lead booster as part of my lead chain for all of my individual instruments. So whether they're separate pedal boards, they'll all have that kind of setup. So 2 different pedals as a lead boost really allows me to rein it in, especially when I'm doing very fast tap work on guitar or on electric violin, which I use a lot, when I'll be doing, again, kind of like the heavy distortion, high gain, meedly kind of stuff. I want that to have this abrupt punch and cut, but I don't want anything to ever step out of line, and that's where a compressor comes in to be really useful. You might want to run a compressor at the very beginning of your chain, right after your tuner. You might want to run a preamp like that exotic EP booster also right at the beginning of your chain. When you connect different kinds of effects, whether they are buffered bypass, like most of the boss effects, or if they're true bypass, where there is no buffer of any kind, you need to figure out how to maintain the quality of your signal all the way through. So having a thing like a bypass or a buffered preamp in the very beginning of your chain helps. Having a mix of both buffered and unbuffered pedals, true bypass pedals, is great because it maintains a bit more unity throughout your signal chain. So if we're thinking about all that stuff, say you have a pedal board, say your amp does not just have an input on the front end into the preamp, say you have an effects loop. Then this comes down to what effects go in the effects loop, what effects don't go in the effects loop. And I would largely make that decision based on whether the amp that I'm using has one channel, two channels, or even more channels than that. Am I going to use the other channels, one of them for a distortion? Am I going to use one of them for a lead booster? I have to make that decision up front, and then that's going to impact things. You can still stack effects in whatever order you want, but when you insert things in an effects loop, you have to know where in the signal chain inside the amplifier does that effects loop get injected. It's definitely the cleanest way to run your effects. For sure, you're running a way more discrete, straight through signal path than going through one pedal into another with lots of little jumpers in between. So you have a level of control there that's fantastic. But the role that your effects, like time-based effects, have is certainly going to change. You need to know that you need to have an effects loop that when it isn't pushing a signal, when the amp is no longer feeding a signal through it, that it doesn't abruptly stop feeding that signal. Because the same thing would happen if you were using a delay or a reverb on a pedal board that didn't allow for tails at the end, and you just abruptly turn them off. So you go from a big sound to an immediately dry sound. There's nothing really logical about that, because that's not the way that we experience the world. The only time that you would want that kind of thing is if you were trying to make a statement with it. And I'll use a huge swell cascading verb and delay to a brick wall stop to make a statement when you want to have this to digital black. That's a killer moment to use that. So knowing all of your gear is really at the core of this here. Every instrument is going to be different. Every single instrument you connect to your rig is going to sound different. So I have guitars and violins that sound outstanding through my rig, and then I have others that I hook up and I don't have at all the same results. Pickups make a difference. The wood that the instrument is made out of, or composite material the instrument's made out of, all that stuff makes a difference. So sometimes it's as simple as a level change, and for that, it's great to have a little booster pedal in line that you can turn on and off. Say you switch between two guitars that are dramatically different output. You want to have a pedal at the front end of your pedal board chain that you can toggle that so you don't have to constantly readjust. Because if your clean to overdriven or distortion sound is dramatically different in volume, that's not really gonna let you sit in the mix the right way when you're performing. So, it's a fairly significant amount of stuff. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And also, as always, in the comments, please let me know what you want me to talk about. I have so many things in my head that I'd like to send your way, but I'm kind of grasping at straws here to figure out what you guys want to hear from me. Every Wednesday at 12 noon, this has been Building Blocks. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Have a great week. And I will see you right back here next week. Cheers.